What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today, returning to the podcast is my friend Tad DeLay. He is a philosopher of religion, a specialist in psychoanalysis, and in his brand new book, he brings those tools to analyzing our ongoing climate catastrophe. The new book is titled Future of Denial, The Ideologies of Climate Change. It is an amazing book. It's a fascinating, fun, terrifying, and hopefully problematizing and energizing conversation with a really good friend of mine who's brilliant, and I think it comes out in the conversation. So excited for you to check this one out. Before we hop in, I want to remind you of two things. Right now, it's May when this episode comes out. But in June, the ticket prices for Theology Beer Camp this October in Denver, Colorado go up. So if you want to hang out with us October 17th and 19th with 500 plus other theology nerds, over 30 different God pods, over 20 different theologians and scholars like last week Brian McLaren was on, Ilya Dilio's going to be there, Jorg Rieger, Gary Dorian, Adam Clark, Grace G. Sun Kim, Leah Robinson, Christy, Whaley, Catherine, Keller. Come on. It's going to be a nerdy fiesta of awesomeness. So head over to theologybeer.camp. Grab your ticket before the price goes up in June. And if you're saying to yourself, whoa, Trip, I'm already getting overloaded with the excitement of America's upcoming presidential election. I know what I don't want to be. I know what kind of makes me grossed out, Christian nationalism and such, but how do we think and process this theologically in different ways? Well, my friends, Diana Butler-Bass and Tim Whitaker from the New Evangelicals are joining me for a class this June, Faith and Politics for the Rest of Us. If you head over to faithandpolitics.net, you can sign up. It's donation-based, including zero, and you will get to, not just to hang out with us, process it and unpack it, but we are bringing 6 different scholars to join us. They're going to be helping us understand the history and context for what we're in. And then, guess what? Guess what happens after that? We have 4 different theologians bringing possibilities for different kinds of theological and political engagement, different schools of thought per se. And it's going to be a doozy old time. So go to faithandpolitics.net, join the fun, hang out with us online, and bring your friends, use it in a reading group. Who knows? But just come on out. It's going to be a good one. Well, you know what I mean? Yeah. Anyway, I'm super pumped that Tad's back on the podcast. I hope you enjoy the interview. You should definitely check out the book if you're vibing with the conversation. I absolutely loved it. And, you know, I have this thing when it's like my friend that writes a book and then it's this good. Like I probably spent 2 or 3 chapters in the middle just a bit jealous that it was this good. And then I was like, but he is your friend, so you should celebrate that. And I'm like, yeah. And then you're like, maybe you should invite him on the podcast. I'm like, I should. And then when I was rewatching this and editing it, I was like, I didn't ruin it. Like Tad totally blows things out of the water, helps you think, wrestle, reflect. And so enjoy my conversation with Tad. And I will put links on the blog post for this episode so you can see links to the book, some of his other work, other times he's been on the podcast. And he made a podcast series introducing over a few short episodes, the main themes and content of the book. And so definitely go check that out if you're down for listening and learning more. But yeah, anyway, smoochy boochies, friends. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is a friend of mine, a fellow student at Claremont, Tad DeLay. So thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for inviting me back on, Trip. It has been a long time.
I know it happens. But this is your this is the 3rd book, right?
Fourth book. Yeah.
Future of Denial. And it's one that you've been working on for quite a while.
Yeah. I have been working on this since, I guess I got the email from an editor at Verso who had heard of my work from a few of his colleagues in, I believe, October or November of 2020. So I have been working on this for more than 3 years now, which is quite a long time for a book project for me. So I am terribly excited to see it out there. It's out April 9th, and I hope it is a benefit.
Mm-hmm. So you've spent time dealing with psychoanalysis and religion. You use those as kind of tools for examining white conservative evangelicalism in America in the past. So as a scholar of religion and thinking with the kind of like philosophical frameworks that you've spent time in, at what point did that connection of to climate crisis, ecological suicide, and things like what was the moment where the infrastructure of your kind of theoretical framing found that connection point to a global crisis?
Right. Well, it would be fair to say that much of my theoretical work for the last decade or more has been all with psychoanalysis in the background. And even though I don't foreground psychoanalysis nearly as much in this book, the theory of the unconscious and the death drive is everywhere across climate change, right? And certainly the notion of a death drive and sadistic and even masochistic enjoyment, anxiety, what does the other want? All of those types of, symptoms that psychoanalysis elucidates are everywhere in the climate crisis, right? But I would also say, I started reading, climate change has been kind of a background interest of mine all throughout my graduate studies. And I think something that anyone engaged in religious studies or philosophy can tell you is that there is this peculiarity where what people believe is what they obsess over, right? Especially within like Protestant-inflected Christianities. But belief often does not really have much to do with how people behave. Belief is also very ephemeral. People will pick up their beliefs and abandon them. People will be very unconcerned with how consistent their beliefs are. Belief is really just kind of like not that important to people, right? And even though they experience it as incredibly important. And I guess I noticed a lot that first off, when you're studying theology, you're studying with crisis in the background all the time, like fraying empires, plagues very often, right? Things that feel like the end of the world or the beginning of something new. So on the one hand, you're looking at that, and you're also looking at how people organize themselves around things that they cannot prove, but find immense meaning in. And so to skip over to the way that climatologists talk about belief, I kept coming across what felt like a kind of a misplaced Protestantism in climatology, right? Where the idea is that not enough people believe the correct thoughts, and we need to get people saved by having them believe the correct things so that they can behave appropriately, right? And I think any theologian can tell you that is just not, that is not how it works, right? So I guess I started seeing a lot of examples. I started cataloging examples kind of starting in 2018, 19 of what felt like conversion symptoms of denial, right? The idea of, what this behavior that we're seeing seems like what would happen if you took somebody who doesn't believe in or care about climate change when suddenly confronted with its effects. And we can go into all kinds of examples of that if you would like, but that's the general theoretical orientation. I should also say, climatology as a community, while they're doing incredible work, it's sort of subdivided into hard sciences, carbon accounting, social sciences. It has no humanities, right? No, there's no critique of political economy, right? We're just taking kind of neoclassical orthodoxy and kind of applying it onto carbon accounting schemes. And so I think that there are massive opportunities for the humanities to contribute.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the question of denial, part of what you do in the text is you make denial a much bigger problem than the average, liberal person who's likely listening to this podcast, where in their head, like the big problem is a bunch of people that thinks it's a Chinese hoax trying to undermine American capitalism or something like that. Mm-hmm. But the denial is at the root of the problem, regardless of the performance of truth in the public square. So can you So my thesis is actually really simple. Denial should be a flexible term designating a broad range of activity, right? And I think denial is best theorized as a tendency to negate threats in accord with material relations
generating symptomatic activity in order to justify, curate, and maintain regimes of power and material relations, right? And so I'm not cleverly twisting some new definition of denial. I am not trying to say we have thought of denial this way and we need to think of it this way. I'm actually saying that basically we always talk about denial as something that is both in your thoughts and in your activity, except when it comes to climate change. And we need to start talking about it with climate change like we talk about it with everything else, right? So what do I mean? We very often talk about teenage recklessness, right? Like smoking cigarettes or unprotected sex or like driving recklessly or whatever, as a type of like denial of mortality, a belief in invincibility, right? So it's enacted, like disbelief, right? Or we talk about how troubling symptoms in my stomach I might ignore because I'm worried that a physician might diagnose as cancer, right? Expensive purchases or self-sabotage during a midlife crisis is kind of a denial of fading youth and unsatisfied desires. We talk about people, ignoring signs that a partner is unfaithful, or people will go to great lengths to talk around their racist ideas with euphemisms, or people will express their denial about their lack of satisfaction at work by drinking themselves to death, right? Basically, we are constantly enacting denial in all kinds of manifestations that are material, right? But we talk about climate change in climate denial as specifically as if it's just a mental problem, right? And the solution is to get the maximum number of people with like the yard sign that says, in this house, we believe science is real, right? And that will fix things, right? When we actually have really good social science evidence, in addition to just, anecdotal evidence, right? That actually public belief does not materially change anything in American politics, right? There's a really good landmark survey on this that came out some years ago that basically said like what the public believes has a non-significant, near negligible impact on what actually happens, right? And you can look up and down like how popular is single-payer healthcare or medical marijuana or the death penalty, right? You could kind of like list anything that has massive public support. There's no correlation between that and what is actually implemented in policy, right? So I'm very concerned about this idea that denial is just a belief, when the actual things that will get people hurt, right? The vulnerable, the migrants, the people who are going to be displaced and hurt. This all has to do with like reaction symptoms to denial, right?
Yeah. Part of what you do in the book is lay out all the ways in which the community who are denying has grown. Right. So from those that were involved and aware early on about the consequences of carbon dioxide and the way the climate change is impacting the environment, the way it's triggering mass migration, and that in telling the story, the scientific story of growing awareness, you also end up demonstrating the way in which knowledge is not a key component for transformation, right? And that's what's going on in the emphasis there of a thick description of denial. And part of that is it problematizes, I think, the kind of liberal in the philosophical sense, not in the political tribe, notion of kind of political engagement. So like when you start to think about the power of material reality, the way in which denial, both conscious and unconscious, shapes our formation, and the limits and lack of responsiveness to like even what a consensus of beliefs look like, right? In the mechanisms of power. How does this kind of the future of denial present the crisis of politics, as well as in its connection to the crisis that's taking place in the planet?
Right. Okay. So I'm very much a Freudian and a Marxist in my approach in this book, right? And in the Marxism is much more foregrounded than it has been in the past, and the Freudianism is a little more backgrounded. But Freud, in one of his essays, kind of talks about how when the repressed starts to surface, people will kind of respond in one of two ways to negate the anxiety of the repressed coming to the surface. One is that they can deny reality. Right, they can just kind of say this idea that I'm worried about. I'm just going to, ignore it. Right, it's not real. And the other is to accept the idea that's coming to the surface, but to distance oneself from moral culpability, right? So we have a kind of reality denial and a guilt denial. And I kind of joke that many Western countries conveniently have a major political party for whichever form of denial you would like to take, right? But also, I'm interpreting this through what Marx would call the law of capitalist accumulation, right? The capitalist accumulation works not by use values, but by accumulating surplus and exchange values, right? The essential problem is that the fossil fuel resources that we have on hand that we can access with today's technology and at today's price points, the current valuation, not saying that this is exactly what we would get, due to a range of factors if we were to extract them, but the current valuation of accessible fossil fuel reserves on the books is $259 trillion. That is enough to raise temperature another 1.5 degrees on top of the 1.3 so far, and bring us back to roughly where temperatures were during the Pliocene epoch, when sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher.
Wasn't really optimal for Homo sapiens.
No, we didn't even exist then. There's actually only been one point in our species' entire history during the Eocene interglacial 125,000 years ago, when temperatures were any warmer than they are right now. And even then, it was only a fraction of degree warmer than right now. But also then, it was 5 to 10 meters higher sea level. So we're up against $259 trillion. That's only the fossil fuels that are accessible right now. So reserves are a subset of all fossil fuels, right? Total fossil fuel resources are worth, by my accounting, almost $2.5 quadrillion. Unfathomable amount of money out there, right? Now, not all of that is extractable by any stretch, and it's mostly coal, but the full valuation of that kind of tells you about a certain direction. And if we were to somehow, by some absurdly demonic miracle, extract all of that and burn it, it would raise temperatures more than 20 degrees, and Earth would probably be only habitable in the very, very highest of latitudes for, a few tenths of thousands of people who were lucky enough to grow food in hell. And so, I want to say that the type of denial that we were up against is materially incentivized, right? So you start getting the awareness that there is a carbon problem, and for one example, an electric company wanting to offset its new coal plant in 1989 invents the first carbon offset. And what do? They buy up a lot of lands from the poor in Guatemala. A lot of these carbon accounting schemes work by basically expropriating people of their indigenous lands. They planted a lot of non-native trees. They passed laws to criminalize the native populations from chopping down those trees for firewood, and then almost nothing was captured, right? That's the first carbon offset, right? And even emissions trading schemes in the EU, for example, basically kind of say, all of these schemes where tons and tons of money is trading, trying to acknowledge the reality of the crisis, but interact with it through capitalist market mechanisms. These aren't really doing a whole lot. They are lowering emissions, but very often you'll see these studies that kind of say, okay, the EU's emissions trading system is lowering emissions by something like 2%, 5% most, right? So they are doing something, but they're not doing what we need. And it's the reality is very different than when you see the option to click to buy a tree offset or whatever to offset your flight, as if that's going to make a measurable difference when it's just not, right? I'm very kind of concerned with the ways that even the acknowledgement of climate change kind of drives all kinds of subsidiary activities that basically kind of waste time. And I guess one more thing to say on this is, for a few years ago, kind of around the time that especially Greta Thunberg was starting her Fridays for Future, we were actually seeing massive increases in public awareness and belief in climate change. And there was this idea that that's the destiny, right? That this is an upward trajectory, the changes are ramping up, and belief is going to ramp up, and then we'll start to do something about it. And then we've actually seen it kind of just stall out, right? So America's a really typical country in the world in this way, because we have about half and half belief. It's 70-something% of people believe in climate change, but is it man-caused? It's more like 55%. So we're kind of like a half and half country. Developed countries usually believe more. But American aversion to knowledge, kicks us back down to kind of the global average, right? Recently, belief among Democrats has actually dropped back down, right? So we're actually kind of seeing backwards. And you can kind of think of this in tandem with when Biden announced that he pledged to never ban fracking, and after which Democrat support for fracking increased 16% within weeks, right? So belief can kind of go back and forth. Again, people don't care that much about their beliefs. They think they do, right? They get stressed out about them, but they don't act on them, right? So it's negligible. And also young conservatives are believing in climate change like in numbers we've never seen before. And there's no reason whatsoever to think that that is a good thing, right? If they follow the pattern of European far-right parties, when they talk about climate change, what they will start to do, this is a pattern noticed by Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective, basically European far-right parties, whenever they talk about climate change, they make a statement about migration as well, right? So to acknowledge the crisis might be a way to kind of package in even more bigotries.
You kind of contrasted these two types, like following out of kind of the trajectories of repression, like, oh, we're gonna repress this whole thing. We're gonna come up with all these denial in some direct way. And then there's the others that are like, in a sense, they feel guilty. So all of a sudden, reality is a sin management problem, and it's like, so what are you going to do with that, right? So you can think of, I mean, you joked about it in your last book about, like, having an accountability group where you just don't masturbate as a way of handling like purity culture guilt, and you're like, oh, we're finally figuring out how to deal with our biological material urges that come from being a species that evolves out, blah 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 blah.
Right,
you're like, oh, we believe these things, now we're gonna go do this, and like the moment it gets put in that guilt category, then there's some genuine relief anytime you respond to anything, right, that's in that situation. I 2 or 3 times a week, as a form of self-torture, watch Joe Biden's favorite TV show, but the podcast version on 2.5 speed, Morning Joe. And I tell myself, this is why our country's going to die, because it's performing that other option, right? Where first off, let's make fun of people that think it's a hoax from China or are denying it. Second, let's run an entire news organization that's funded by the companies that most benefit from ongoing material denial, like, I don't know, airlines, the military industrial complex. Like, you start going through, who funds those things, and then, like, look at our sustainable coffee mug, coffee that's over here. Oh, let's talk about carbon offsets. Let's think that Mayor Pete's like arrived for the future of like our transportation system and its greening, and that the Green New Deal, we didn't quite get there, but Joe Biden's done more for the environment than any president of all time. Underneath it is this way in which, as long as you have the other that's just in denial, then any acknowledgement in doing anything lets you just compare yourself to others and pat yourself on the back. You're like, I recycled. I even, get this, Ted, I cleaned the Cool Whip and peanut butter out of these plastic things that normally you'd have to throw away unless you cleaned them. I'm basically the eschaton right there, enacted. And so I'm like, part of what you do in the book is kind of go like a pox on both of your houses bit, and realizing the dynamism between them. So like imagining that group, or imagining a lot of our friends. And the thing about this is, like, you can even experience it as a criticism of you, and you don't have a community that has like a communal way of embodying outside the predicament that you're describing.
There's no escaping the guilt, right? By driving to get groceries, I emit carbon dioxide from my car, about 1/5 of which will still be in the atmosphere in 500,000 years, killing animals that have not yet evolved, right? I mean, it's an unfathomable amount of violence that is just kind of ingrained in just existing in the West, right? And there's a certain floor to where we can lower our carbon footprints. I even talk about like a study done by MIT in the book that kind of says, what's the floor you could do, right? If you experienced homelessness, if you don't own a car, you don't live in a house, you use very little electricity, you're still emitting something like 1/3 to half of what an average American emits, right? Like there's a floor, right? So one of the things that I want to do in the book is also kind of say there's really no out, right? Like if you're reading this for kind of what's the solution, and like I hint at certain solutions that I think are terribly critical for us to think through, and we can get to those in a moment. But I sort of say, instead of having like the deniers and the believers, I kind of say, I want to talk about 4 positions in the book. And I do this in the intro, right? I say, basically you have the classic capitalist denialist, ideological state apparatuses, the Exxons, the industry groups that are kind of spreading misinformation. And in arrayed against this, you have a capitalist climate governance, right? The good liberals, the market based incentive structures, the Paris agreements, the COP process, and all of that, right? And those are sort of in owning class interests, right? They're both very clear that we need to protect markets and keep our returns on investment high, right? And so again, this is, the denial and affirmation, and then also working class and owning class interests from the Marxism, right? So on the working class, the 99% of us are kind of arrayed on two ends of a spectrum, or somewhere on a spectrum, right? From, on the one hand, the kind of classic reactionary ethno-nationalist, denialist type. And on the other hand, the activist, the eco-socialist, the communist, it can look like a lot of things, right? There's on the working class end of addressing this problem, there's a lot of ideological diversity, right? And one of the things that I say in the book, and I don't mean this as a joke, because like by the end of this book, you're going to have to kind of reckon with in what ways even that activist working class component is rife with denial, and there may be just no escape from that, right?
Yeah.
And among the owning classes, I mean, like there's so many examples, right? I remember right when I started on this book, one of the first things that happened was I was driving to, it was during COVID, and I would sometimes like take a drive just to get out of my house and clear my head for a minute. And I heard, a report on NPR about, some new book about green capitalism, which might be able to save us from the climate crisis. And I thought, what is this? Like, what's going on? Why are we talking about a book where some guy is saying, can we make capitalism sustainable, as if that's some sort of innovation? Like, what's going on here, right? But I also, one of the examples I think of embodied liberal denial that was sort of lurking in the background, especially early on in 2020, that was still kind of there, as kind of one of the early ideas for the book. But I mean, like kind of right up there with the Portland story that I begin with, but maybe we can get to in a moment, and how much are fossil fuel reserves worth. The simple fact is in late 2019 and early 2020, we saw in the Corbyn proposals in UK Labour and the Sanders movement within the Democratic primary for president, the 2 most ambitious plans for climate action ever proposed, right, by those 2 countries. And we saw liberals in both countries organize against them, right? Now, they weren't doing that because they detest the climate overtly, right? But there is I spent a whole book talking about the reactionary conservatives, right, in my last one. So I take it to the liberals a little bit more in this one. What does the liberal want? Well, I'm not convinced that liberals can be seen as, especially owning class liberals, can be seen as an ally if they detect egalitarianism in the pipeline, right? In any kind of green neutral, like whatever that looks like, right? Like serious action that we need is going to involve a type of socialist-inflected egalitarianism that liberalism will react against, right? Like one of the things that I say is, because liberalism wants personal rights, but it's also beholden to capitalism, it sort of ends up siding with the conservatives on a whole host of issues, right? Because at the end of the day, liberalism does not want to think that anybody's ever discriminated against on account of sexuality or race for housing, right? But it firmly believes that some people ought to be owners, extracting rents from workers, right? So there is a certain class hierarchy that gets preserved within that. And it's that we should be especially attuned to, especially in the solutions proposed. One of the solutions example, kind of getting back to our 2020 primary example, right, is I think the second most ambitious climate program was proposed by Elizabeth Warren. During the 2020 Democratic primary, who I don't like, right? But like one of the things that I thought was very funny was that she, as one of her linchpins in her green proposal was greening the military, right? And what she pointed to was an army plan called the Net Zero Initiative. And I read through the plan. I don't know if the staffers who included that link on our website read through it. I read through it kind of amazed because it doesn't actually plan to get to net zero emissions. It's just called net zero. There's no way to green the military. Like there's no alternative for jet fuel, right? But the plan does spend a lot of time talking about reducing the amount of toilet water used on military bases, right? So the plan among smart knowers of science in liberal capitalist government is to reduce the amount of toilet water. And it is precisely this type of bullshit that I think is so concerning as we approach this climate crisis and increasingly know things but are prohibited from doing anything that actually would kind of matter. I didn't even talk about like what, I think also your question, let me just kind of say quickly, and we can come back to this if you would like, what can people do, right? Because there are things that people can do. And we're all kind of aware, I think, at this point that measuring our iniquities with a carbon footprint is a pretty limited tool that BP was very kind of genius on, in successful marketing. But there are things that you can do. They're just all they're very boring or they're very terrifying, right? Like you could become an eco-terrorist, right? But you probably don't want to do that. You could do things that are very boring, but extremely important, right? Like as far as mitigating emissions goes, probably one of the more important things an average person could do is start attending municipal zoning hearings, right? Because a third of our emissions, depending on how you account, comes from buildings. Buildings draw electricity on the one hand, and then they also burn directly natural gas for their water boilers, water heaters and air boilers, right? And so a lot of major cities in the U.S. are starting to ban new gas hookups to buildings, right? But to do that, local officials need a lot of support, right? They need people going to the hearings demanding it. They need to get political cover if they're going to put themselves on the line for something that's going to cost more money and get them organized against by the industries. So the solutions that you actually can engage in are things like that, right? And you can also think about adaptation emissions, right? So there's mitigation, right? Lowering the emissions. And there's only a few strategies that we can really do there. And then there's adaptation, which is tons of things, right? It might mean you need to get ready for the climate migrants. What can your community do to facilitate food and housing for people who will very often not be documented? So what you will be doing is illegal, right? Are you willing to do that, right? Learning how to grow food may be important, right? But if you're going to learn to grow food, you probably need to learn how to handle weapons, right? And that starts to take us down scarier routes, right? And so you can do personal things like stop eating meat or flying, right? But it's a complicated question of like how much are you willing to commit to this? Because every material incentive is against doing so.
Yeah, there was an element in it, and it came to mind in chapter 9 on what does a liberal want that you raised, how the kind of activist working class group could be just as engaged in denial as the traditional enemies, right? If you're doing kind of materialist analysis without recognizing the ecological background, there's a kind of a stronger dynamic of power to raise it when it's just kind of in the economic and cultural space. It's different when it gets complexified by putting it in the ecosystem. And one of the places that my mind went reading it, and went from taking notes to making commentary and wanting to talk to you about it, is the sense that part of the way culture internalizes the logic of the economism within us is like we all know acceleration in so many elements is required. Like you can't just stay the same in so many areas of your life and be stable. So capitalism as a whole has to be growing. And that's and when it's formulated initially without even the variables of carbon and the energy it provides there, that creates part of it. But then even for us, like in our own, just as dads, right? Like you sit there and go, oh, I see this system. Here's the long-term impact. Here's how it creeps on your soul and turns you into lifeless people with debt slavery from graduate school trying to get to the blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and then you look at your kids and go, yep, except since I can't change this game, I either have to decide to teach them how to win at a game that's part of the collective eco side of our species. So they have to play the game for culture and for in society and learn how to win at the market game. And then you have to stay winning. And then we're going to do the same with our technology where it's always accelerating. And like, oh, are there questions we should probably be asking around AI and its implementation? Yeah, but who's going to get the bomb first? Who's going to get generalized intelligence first? Like, don't you want the good guys to get it? Come on, we're going to do this. And there's this at the very heart of kind of our economism as religion is the need for acceleration. And one of the things that came to mind in that is there's this very familiar conversation I've had with lots of people in our similar spaces with similar backgrounds of there not being a way to opt out and know how, like, to secure a future, right? Because it's part of your title for yourself and for your kids and for your grandkids. So opting out's not an option. But I had never connected the dots that internalization of the drive of acceleration is the very dial that increases alienation at the heart of our entire web of life. That as the drive of acceleration gets more intense and opting out becomes more and more a fantasy, the alienation between you and your neighbor and your enemy and your non-human neighbors gets more and more intense. I have no idea what to do. It just made my concern about acceleration and economism as the one true global religion that demands the sacrifices of human beings on its altar even more depressing. So thank you.
Right. Yeah. Wealth comes from labor in the land, right? And to extract from either is alienating, right? I mean, this is kind of one of Marx's points back from his philosophical and economic manuscripts, right? When he was like 26 years old, he's kind of making this observation that the labor process produces this condition of exploitation and what he calls alienation, right? And there's just no way around this, right? I wrote this book, it occurs to me, I think this is the first time that we've spoken at length since I became a father in 2020, right? And so that was, definitely in the background since, so now I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And
don't worry, I stalk you on social media and just look at all the cute pictures.
The concern for them is intense, right? And I will say that while I became more politically pessimistic, in other ways I became more optimistic through this project. Like it was actually really helpful to learn how to do the math and realize that we could meet all of our energy needs by covering just 0.5% of the Earth's land surface in solar panels, right? The idea that basically anybody in this community will tell you that outside of a few types of innovations and sped up technologies that we need, we basically have the tools to address it. The problems are all political, right? And if you are a good materialist, that means the problems are with the law of capitalist accumulation, right? That's what's driving the alienation and the destruction of the earth, right?
Which is why at the beginning, raising all the data, like bringing to the fore, like, okay, if we have the technology and we have the solutions and we have the know-how, like, what are the reasons we don't do X? Well, it might be the trillions of dollars.
Yeah, it might be that like somebody wants at least a few of the $259 trillion, right? And if we were to ban all of that today, if we were to never burn another fossil fuel, it would be really, really great for most life on Earth, but it would be unconscionable, right, to human life, right? We would lose the natural gas for the Haber process and starve 3 billion people in the first year alone. There's also kind of going back to the acceleration and the need for growth. Fossil fuels provide 4/5 of our energy. And if you look at their correlation coefficients with GDP, you're talking about something that's almost 1-to-1. It's like 0.969 on the relation between burning fossil fuels and dollars, right? And so economic growth has everything to do with fossil fuels right now. And that's, of course, I want to clarify, I talk about this in the book, that's a mystification, right? To talk about the coupling of emissions and GDP is really because the way that we organize ourselves, rich people burn more, right? So that produces a certain type of relationship. But it's also true to say we just don't have energy that can scale up in time if we were to ban all fossil fuels next week or something, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I began my book with what stood out to me in 2020 in September. Some people will remember vivid images of the skies along California and the Pacific Northwest where the sky was orange from wildfires. In some places, the hue at noon was literally blood red, right? You could barely make out the sun at noon, right?
Your car looks like it has dandruff in the morning.
Yeah,
like
yeah. No, like it was unlike
yeah.
anything that I had ever seen, at least not at that mass scale. And this was right after, this was the year of COVID. It was just after the summer of George Floyd protest. We were approaching this election. Trump was increasingly asking for militaries in the streets. Reactionaries were ramming people with their cars. Conservative legislators were rushing bills to authorize the manslaughter tactics. America was about to erupt. And in the midst of that, I encountered a few journalists that I follow on Twitter who kind of said, we just got stopped by a militia outside of Portland. And they were telling us they were snapping at us, get the fuck out of here, and taking pictures of us and our license plates. And I started chasing this, and there were multiple independent towns around Portland where these improvised checkpoints were being set up by white men with rifles, who were mostly stopping and pointing weapons at reporters and families, and especially African, like an African-American mother kind of says, yeah, like it was very clear when they say, you're not from around here, are you? They're talking about like, this is a very white area of the country, right? And this mother is fleeing wildfires and she's getting stopped, and the cops can see that this is happening and they are encouraging it, right? We actually have on record, one cop was encouraging citizens to go out and get away with killing outsiders, right? Because the myth was that all of these fires were being started by Antifa, right? So this to me is denial, right? Like how does imaginary Antifa activists become a more important and intuitive explanatory heuristic for wildfires than a warming climate where we knew this was going to happen, right? And so that's what it means to convert denial or carelessness into material, concrete manifestations of denial, right? But one more example of what this means, kind of getting back to your kind of material reality here, right? Is, so I live in Baltimore, and I live about 10 minutes from the harbor, but I live about 70 meters above sea level. I need to worry about the increase in sea level sometime in the next 2 to 10,000 years, right? Then sea level will come up to about 70 meters and inundate the lower foundation of my house. So I'm not worried about that, right? I am worried about, though, what happens when the hydrological cycle boosts because we are introducing as much energy into the atmosphere now the problem is Earth energy imbalance, right? The sun is hitting us with the same energy as always. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases make the sky more opaque at infrared wavelengths where the energy emits off the surface. So we're holding in energy, and that energy is equivalent to about 900,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs of energy per day. All of that energy boosts the hydrological cycle. So we get more storms, more powerful storms, more rainfall, more polar vortexes, and so forth, right? And so I'm not worried about sea level coming up where I am, right? Other parts of Baltimore will have to worry about that. But I am not worried about that where I am, right? However, if the hydrological cycle starts meaning that my basement floods more often, and eventually maybe the first floor starts to flood every once in a while, there's a future in which my house perhaps loses a third of its resale value in a year, right? And homes are people's primary investment instrument, right? So we're talking about massive losses of even the possibility of intergenerational wealth. And what that also means is that neighborhoods will start selling off. Other homes in the area will start to depreciate as well. Taxes for schools will start to drop. So the school qualities will drop. Crime will increase, right? Because crime is correlated with inequality. So police budgets will balloon, businesses will move out, racism will reorganize, what types of a community is welcome here, and who needs to be policed and all of that, right? And so the whole community can kind of suffer just by having more rainfall, right? And so the material, what are the material incentives in that case, right? I like to think of myself as somebody who is opposed to the exploitation of people for rent, or opposed to the ballooning of police budgets, right? But the material incentives are for someone like me, who is lucky enough to be one of the few homeowners in the millennial group that I am, to care greatly about protecting me and mine, right? And forgetting all others, right? Let them fend for themselves. That's the material incentives, right? So, we are, futures.
So can you unpack some of the stories we tell ourselves that we're doing to manage the situation? In chapter 10, you talk about, adaptation and mitigation and these technological fixes, and they function as seductions. And I think that it's great for people to be thinking about ways to make a difference and change and all that kind of stuff. But part of the energy of the book is also showing like the underside of those kind of desires, and perhaps like what that they're kind of like guilt management responses, not solutions.
Yeah. So this is a fast. So I wanted to write a whole chapter just to kind of say what can we do to fix this, right? On the technological side, at least, right? And so we're looking at two buckets, right? Mitigation and adaptation, right? That is the language that the climatology community will use. Mitigation is the reduction of emissions. Adaptation is adjusting society to a changing world, right? So mitigation has a few small sets of options, right? Basically, we can reduce emissions by improving efficiency. 2, we can electrify anything that's run on fossil fuels. And then 3, we can implement carbon capture to clean up the rest. Right. So that's those 3 basic buckets. Right. And then we have a few things like biomass and hydrogen cells and things like that are kind of like at the periphery, may become more important. Right. But you can kind of think of our mitigation options as those 3. Right. Efficiency, electrification, and carbon capture. Right. Adaptation, on the other hand, has a range of things. Right. Seawalls for areas that are not labeled sacrifice zones. More cropland, expanded to kind of account for the cropland that we're going to lose, and a new land that we'll plant crops on will be less efficient because it'll be in less ideal zones. Budgets for fire departments, right? Boost to reinsurance companies. There's a million different things that you can kind of talk about in the adaptation bucket, right? Whereas the mitigation bucket is fairly small. So let's think 2 examples, right? To kind of think about limits. One is planting trees, right? So I am all for planting trees. I think we should plant all kinds of trees. It lowers temperatures within a city. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's good for wildlife. There's all kinds of reasons you want more trees, right? And one of them is that they suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? I think there is this dangerous illusion that we could just plant trees and that is kind of the big solution, right? You're hearing this constantly, and anybody who models this community, like this literature, will tell you that we should be planting trees as one component, right? But it's a limited tool, right? There was a recent study that came out that says that we could basically sequester about 200 gigatons of carbon dioxide if we planted every single tree possible on the entire planet, right? There's limits to how many trees we can plant because trees need not just land, but they need water and they need nitrogen and a few other nutrients. It's a bit like baking a cake. If you have like all of the ingredients but one, you have a limit to how many cakes you can bake, right? So there's a limit to how many trees that we can plant. If we planted every tree possible in the entire world, it would reduce carbon dioxide emission or its carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere from 420 right now to about 370. So it would reduce it by about 50, right? That's a great improvement, but that's roughly where we were in like when we invaded Iraq, right? It doesn't take us back to pre-industrial. It starts to get us closer to where we need to go, but there are limits. And again, that's if we planted every single tree possible, it would reduce about 20 years worth of damage, right? On the other hand, we hear a lot about like different types of carbon capture machines, right? Recently the Climeworks Orca plant went online in Iceland. And it was the biggest carbon capture plant ever, right? It just pulls carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere. And if it is successful in a year, it will sequester about 3 seconds of emissions from the global production, right? Now, there's we should be dumping trillions of dollars into this, right? And one of the things that I do like in Biden's IRA bill that passed was funding for several new ultra-massive carbon capture plants, right? So that's good. Like, we need to spend a lot of money. But in moderate emission scenarios, if we just to kind of shift, just to give you a perspective, in moderate emission scenarios, if we just kept emitting exactly as much as we are right now, if we didn't drop emissions at all and we just tried to clean it up with these machines that scrub the air, it would cost, if the prices come down to where we hope they will come down to, which is about a fifth of where they are now, it would cost roughly $5 trillion per year, right? Just in carbon capture. And if we go to a more high emission scenario, it could cost as much as $16 trillion per year, right? So these are absurd numbers. We're not going to spend that much money. I want to see billions and even trillions of dollars dumped into this technology, but they're limited, right? If you listen to the oil industry, they will constantly talk about the benefits of carbon capture, right? Without saying that they're going to do it, right? They want us to be thinking about this as if we can clean up our sins without investing in actually cleaning up those sins, right? Delta Airlines, when it dubiously claimed, by the way, Delta Airlines claims to be carbon neutral. It did this basically by buying up a bunch of land in Cambodia and Indonesia and just banning locals from cutting down firewood. Didn't plant new trees, just bought up trees that already existed and claims it's carbon neutral. In its report, it also kind of says, also in the future, perhaps there will be carbon capture, but again, doesn't say that they're actually investing in it, right? And so this is how these schemes work, right? You said the truth, intended to deceive you. This is a quote from Lacan. So Lacan, the psychoanalyst, has this wonderful little quote that truth is firstly a seduction intended to deceive you, right? And so we need to think through, like, what does it mean to have the truth that is meant to deceive you on the front end, right? Basically, we were talking about massive new technologies that will become critically important and that we need, that may be salvations later as they scale up. But right now, they are being used by the oil industry and misinformed, well-meaning, liberal agents as well to justify the continued burning of fossil fuel emissions, right? To kind of treat things as if they're, handleable, right? And in so doing, I use the analogy sometimes throughout the book that it's as if we are playing 3-card Monte with the biosphere, where we're just hiding the emissions in some sort of carbon offset or, a promise of taking carbon dioxide out later. And while we're playing this 3-card Monte with the biosphere, we are putting all of our hope in technologies that don't work right now, but probably will later. And the question is, when will they come online, and will we have even decarbonized by then? Because one last thing here, none of this matters if we don't get emissions close to zero, right? Like, all the carbon capture in the world will not compete against fossil fuel emissions until we get close to zero. We need to get at least down to 10% of current emissions for them to have a meaningful difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, in part 5 of the book on barbarism, nothing like ending the book with a smile.
Yeah.
One of the features you raise, and I think is regularly minimized when we consider like the connection between like the accelerating energy of the economy and the way it levels up alienation, is the impact and violence of the system, the primary targets of that violence that is going to exist in migration and in these kind of things.
Yeah.
Can you kind of paint the picture of, even in our best case scenario, the kinds of ethical challenges we're setting up to face in our kids' lifetime?
Yeah. No, that is the migrations and the effects on the vulnerable were the real heart of the book, the real reason for it. I am so deeply concerned for just how brutal this next century could become. I always tell my students on the first day of class that one of the reasons we need to kind of study the humanities and think about like what reflexive ideological assumptions we have kind of been handed and live our lives according to, and also why we need to think about the value systems of others, is because my students live at the beginning of the greatest migration of human beings that has ever happened or ever will happen. There will never be a scale of movement and social adjustment like what we're going to see in the next few decades. It's already ramping up, right? The last ice age was, 4 to 5 degrees Celsius lower, right? We've already warmed the planet 1.3, so we've done about a third of an ice age already. Difference. We're about a halfway to a third of the warming that we're going to do this century. Oxfam says that we're already seeing 20 million people a year displaced by climate change and climate change fueled disasters. The UN estimates that as many as 1 billion people could be displaced by 2050. I think that number is a little high, but it's probably north of a 500 million, right? And one of the things that we kind of, I'm informed by, Theodor Adorno, the philosopher, the critical theorist. said that he survived the Holocaust. He migrated. He was a Jewish German theorist and migrated and lived around World War II in Los Angeles, right? And had almost kind of like a deep, I don't know, like a sense of melancholia, I guess would be the best word for it, for what he escaped that so many others did not. And he said that there is a new categorical imperative imposed on the world by Hitler, the never again, right? That we must arrange all our thoughts and actions so as to never let something like this happen again. And it's that never again, that arrange all our thoughts and actions to think about the barbarism on the horizon that is what compelled me as much as anything else in the book. Climate migrants are going to not look like something easily recognizable as climate migrants, right? The UN has, kind of begged states to create a category for climate migrant asylum, but no category like that legally exists, right? And if you look at the UN Convention on Refugees, there's nothing that could possibly apply to climate change, really. So we need new legal architectures, and climate migrants often don't perceive themselves as climate migrants. Like I tell a story in the book of the 2018 migrant caravan, which was largely triggered by like drought, right, in the dry corridor in the Central Americas. So you have like a caravan of several thousand people coming up. You can't talk about this caravan without talking about climate change, right? But many of the people in it don't perceive themselves as climate migrants, right? They perceive myself, well, my crop yield, was nothing last year. So if I'm going to die, I might as well die trying to get to America, one person says, right? And how did the reactionaries react to that? Well, they just kind of accused them of harboring Islamic State terrorists, right? Which means these people are killable, right? That was the reaction, right? And I started thinking to myself, by the way, Americans won't perceive themselves as climate migrants either, right? How many people were displaced after the 2018 Camp Fire that killed 80 people and displaced tens of thousands? How many, we know that a lot of them left California and will never return, right? Probably richer ones, right? And are now safely happy in the North.
A lot of the wineries had to leave, that.
Right. Well, yeah. And I mean, yeah, but like, how many rich Californians that displaced think of themselves as climate migrants? Probably not, right? Like people move temporarily. They see themselves as moving for work, but perhaps it's because of crop yield loss, which is because of the warmer climate. They don't necessarily perceive themselves or can be perceived by legal architectures as climate migrants, right?
Well, I was actually speaking at an event in Napa maybe a year or so ago, and me and a couple of other of our process friends were discussing this, and one of the clergy heard us talking about the impact of climate change, came home to those that had only heard about, only engaged in it secondhand, and this clergy member was just like, I'd never thought of that we just took it as, oh, well, it's wildfires, and there might be climate related to it, but like the idea that they're sitting there as clergy, and half of the, I don't know if it's half, but like a large number of the congregation had houses burned down, right? And it tore up so much of their jobs, and like the very social relational web of that congregation is in turmoil because so many people moved, and then you're having all the battle with insurance, and then what do you do with it? And like everything connected to those individuals' lives, both businesses, the church, their social relationships, community groups, everything was up in the air, and no one knew what it was going to look like. And I think that it was just interesting that they were dealing with all these little things, thinking of them as pastoral care challenges and how do we support each other, but didn't go, oh, like this is the fruit of a larger crisis.
Yeah, no, I tell the story of this one kid his family was displaced by the Camp Fire, and so a lot of people went to this displaced to this neighboring town, and even entire schools kind of set up in these temporary locations. And one school from Paradise relocated to Chico and was set up in a hardware store, right? And so they're literally having like elementary school classes kind of meeting in the aisles of this hardware store. They're doing like lunch counters at the checkouts and all of this. And there's this teacher who was asking the students to talk about climate change and how they think their life might be impacted by it. So every single one of these kids is a climate refugee, right? Whether they perceive it or not, right? And there was this one kid who answered something like, I don't know if climate change will affect my life because I don't know if I believe in it yet, right? I don't know if climate change will affect my life because I don't know if I believe in it yet, right? So that is, it's such an amazing point, because that is exactly the type of answer you would expect from a child, right? Like, I mean, I'm not blaming the child here, right? That is normal for a child to kind of think in those terms. It is deeply dangerous when adults think in that same turn, right? And I am, another thing that I kind of do in the book is I kind of categorize different types of border externalizations and the technologies that we're seeing Fortress Europe deploy, and how that might kind of work for the US as well, which now, I mean, I'm kind of glad that the AI craze kind of happened after I'd submitted my manuscript in mid 2022. But there is a lot of talk about like how can AI be used to kind of integrate into border technology for facial recognition. To be honest with you, I discussed Israel's situation with Gaza largely out of looking for examples of barbarism, including the use of sentry drones. Right. So again, this is a weird thing to kind of write about and turn in a manuscript in mid 2022 when we've kind of seen like the full scale genocide over the last few months. But for years, Israel has policed its border with Gaza with these sentry turrets that could shoot like a quarter of the way into Gaza, kind of manned by, what is essentially a fancy little iPad, right? And it keeps a man in the loop, but could be fully automated. They also had several types of rover drones that could kind of move around within Gaza, and they had machine guns on it. Those rover drones, by the way, can be loaded with less lethal weapons like rubber pellets or beanbags or tear gas. And if you know anything about like, border patrols and American policing, you know that like Israel does a lot of training for our police, right? So don't be surprised if you start seeing fully autonomous AI-driven hunter-killer drones that are just loaded with less lethal pellets and tear gas at a climate protest near you in American streets in the years ahead, right? But I was looking for examples of just kind of like over-the-top violence, right? And I found Israel to kind of be a helpful example in that respect. And I, just for years, I'd kind of been talking about like I just have this just lingering image in my head of like the smart border system, right? And this is largely because of during the Trump administration, people would mock the medieval border wall, right? The quote unquote more medieval border wall, as if that's going to stop anything, right? But the refrain from liberals was, no, we should be doing smart border technologies, right? We should be using biometrics and surveillance, and we're not going to mess with this ridiculous wall. I am deeply terrified of a future in which what smart borders means is automated sentry drones, right? I would used to kind of say this, and friends would almost kind of like laugh at me as thinking that that's too over the top. You're not going to get like smart border drones on the southern U.S. border, right? And I would always just want to say, no, I'm not making this up. This is already happening in the world. This technology is out there. It's being tested. It's being used on human beings. And in the changes ahead, we are going to see a displacement unlike anything that we've ever seen before. It's going to come with economic consequences. We don't know what kinds of depressions we could have on the horizon, but we probably do have some quite frightening declines in economic disruption, right? We will have crop loss, right? Depending on who you ask, anything from like 15 to 50% crop yield loss. And that's just the yield. That's not saying like we'll have 50% less food, right? But we'll have to expand to more territories that are less fertile. But our food's going to become more expensive, right? And we in the US have seen what that looks like in the last year, right? People get really, really frustrated and angry, and their budgets are strained by food just ticking up a tiny bit. What happens when it becomes doubly expensive, right? And it becomes simply too impossible to eat, right? What happens to addiction rates when people are increasingly thrown out of their homes and unable to live in a house, right? So like when we talk about climate migration and violence, we tend to talk about it as if it can be insulated from this or pressured. But I would like people to kind of think what it means when half your population, even in the wealthiest country in the world, is having a hard time feeding themselves, and addiction rates are skyrocketing and police budgets are ballooning, on top of the kind of normal quotidian malaise of late capitalism, where increasingly the only way to make a living is to do work that is either useless or brutal, right? We're increasingly, to kind of get back to what we were talking about with our kids earlier, right? Like it seems obvious to me that like outside of a few professions, like, medical profession, it's increasingly the case that you kind of have to decide, do I want to make money or do good, and you can do neither, right? But you can't really do both very often, right? So multiple layers of social crisis, right? And in the background is carbon dioxide, the molecule that correlates with every single mass extinction in Earth's history. It's always been tied to fluxes of carbon dioxide. And I recount that in a book, right? And that is the crisis that is just, it's sometimes, this term polycrisis gets thrown around, which I use in a couple places, but is almost kind of overused today, right? It's just that the crisis is too much to get anyone's head around, right? And so rather than address it, right, we pretend it can be kind of addressed by paying an extra $1 to plant a tree, right? And that is good enough, because what else are you going to do?
Well, you mentioned something earlier, and I think it might be a good way to let you kind of wrap up and make sure. Obviously, I really hope people go check out Future of Denial, and also you'll be publishing a short podcast series about it.
Yes, yeah. Hopefully, when Future of Denial publishes, there will be a podcast called Future of Denial that will be a 3-part. Kind of quick synopsis of the book with some snippets of it to kind of get more of that research out there if people are not able to get the book.
Well, yeah. Just send me links and things, and I'll time the release. Try to time the release to when the book's out, and those resources are there. But you mentioned at the beginning how in the community of people studying climate change, possible responses, and this thing, you got people working with the hard sciences and thinking about it, the economics of it, and the technological innovation, and the social sciences, and all this kind of thing. But the role for things like the humanities, philosophy, religious and wisdom traditions is not integrated in a deep way. And yet, if we paid attention to the psychological sciences and the social sciences, one of the features for getting a higher participation, volunteering, and use of time, using your material resources for the benefit of others, all those things go up when you're connected to a community with some version of the ultimate at the center. And and that's including like Eastern and Western religion, just trying to be vague and things. And this question got raised at one of the big sessions on the future of the climate, the European Society for Study of Science and Theology that I went to when I was on faculty in Edinburgh. And I'm sitting there at a table with essentially a number of climate scientists related that are there for a bunch of the science stuff, and religion scholars who are not religious or post-religious or whatnot. And the big question they all kept going is like, if we don't figure out how to orient human beings, unless the response connects to human beings in the way we hold people cooperatively through symbolic communication and stuff, I think we're screwed, and none of them know how to do it. Mm-hmm. And there was this kind of like collective action problem that they were raising. And I wonder, thinking of that conversation and then your kind of observations at the beginning about how the humanities, philosophy, religion, religious traditions and stuff haven't been as integrated in the movement as a whole. What kind of advice, suggestions for the thousands of people that are stewarding congregations and part of religious traditions would you have? Like if you're in those spaces and want to at least not suck.
Yeah. Well, so my most honest answer is to say something glib like, like reject your gospel and accept the truth of Freudo-Marxist materialism, and this is the one life we have, and all of that, but no, I mean, I don't think seriously, I think it is critically important for people to understand that there is work to be done, and at the same time, you cannot stop the progress of this storm. This is going to be something this is the most important thing that has ever happened in the history of our species, right? And its effects will reverberate for at least 500,000 years, right? The effects of what we're doing right now will still be on the Earth and killing species after human beings no longer exist as a species recognizable today, right? So you cannot stop the progress of this storm. What you can do is going to be things that are going to be very, very localized, right? So I want to say, at one point I kind of say, like, you need to understand this is the most monumental task. It is the most interdisciplinary problem. Somebody knows the physics, another knows the carbon budgets, another knows the social sciences. And at the same time, sometimes within that community of climatology, they will kind of say, leave the science to the scientists, right? Like, don't try to explain it, just, there's kind of like even when they kind of call for, and I by no means mean to like slander the entire climatology community, like, with this, but there are certain leading, very vocal figures who will kind of say, leave this to us. We've got it. But then they immediately propose facile solutions like, vote for Biden or whatever, that kind of demonstrate no interest in political philosophy or even history, right? This is an extremely interdisciplinary problem, and you have knowledge and resources that you might consider dedicating to your life, to this most important thing that has ever happened, right? To those who are leading communities, I would say, in my experience, groups that are doing work organizing. So I'm going to use an example here in Baltimore. I'm connected to a Democratic Socialist group. That is one of the things that they're doing is working to stop Baltimore from burning its trash, right? So a significant amount of emissions it comes from burning trash, right? I mean, not significant compared to electricity or cars, right? But it is definitely measurable in the carbon budget. It comes from burning trash, right? Like we should not be burning trash. When you burn, plastics, you release the carbon into the atmosphere. It joins, it joins oxygen. And it becomes CO2, right? So that's a group that's working towards that. And in my experience, those activist groups tend to be younger students or grad students, heavily in debt, not making a lot of money. People listening to this who are stewarding congregations might recognize that you have people in your orbit who have money and time, and importantly, many of them have legal training and are able to actually get things done and file briefs and motions that could actually work quite well if you just join up with people who are already doing things, right? Because none of the activists that I know have a law degree, right? And so there are certain limits to what they can do, right? That kind of often are limited to as little as pestering public officials to try to do the good thing instead of the evil thing, right? So understand that you have resources, not time, yes, but importantly, money and legal abilities and know-how within your communities that you ought to be stewarding, right? To things that are already being doing, right? We need more renewable energy. There's a ton on the book on like renewable energy certificates and like how that market's getting distorted and all of that. But we need renewable energy. We also need like less burning of trash. We need, like I said earlier, get involved in the really boring stuff, the municipal zoning codes, right? Go and advocate for the things that are going to cost more money, that are going to reduce emissions, right? And then on the side, that's all the mitigation stuff, right? On the adaptation side, learn to grow food, learn how to get ready to shelter more and more people, either people who are climate migrants or people who are not migrants at all and are just getting kicked out of their house because of the economic damage. Get ready to do things that might be on the edge of illegal, right? Like get in a headspace that understanding like that the changes are going to ramp up, the barbarism is going to ramp up, and the legal state ideological apparatus is going to respond by hurting people, not helping them, right? So you need to be thinking about how you can protect people in ways that are outside the bounds of what is normally considered okay to do.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot more that we could talk about on that, but I think that maybe that's at least a start, right? Get your head around the idea that there's adaptation in addition to mitigation. The mitigation is very limited. The adaptation has a lot of space for you to get creative.
Yeah, I would love to have a conversation with you and Brian McLaren at the same time because his new book that coming out around the same time yours is, I think a week after.
He kind of is, he go far enough back, he's kind of responsible for kind of launching me on a certain trajectory that ended where
everything
am right
has
now,
changed.
so.
So in his new book, Life After Doom, it's really looking at like what do you do if you're just if you recognize so much of the things that you're presenting in the book. And there's a whole section in it where he's talking about the different ways people kind of like envision the collapse narratives from like, doing all these things to kind of avoid collapse. Like, and that's like the good version, but that's the equivalent of like Ministry for the Future good. The book, not like good, like people imagine Elon Musk coming Deus Ex Machina to solve all of our problems, and then like collapse and then rebirth and collapse in like a kind of survival, kind of like post our civilization as we know it, and then collapse into extinction. And you know, in the book, he's trying to invite people to think about the kinds of things that happen once the community of people you live with, religious and non-religious, are facing changes where what you inherited won't be there anymore. Then, like, how do you have conversations around value, justice, the good? How do you orient your resources, time, and connections when the preservation of the system you're inheriting, you would not call it good, and you're preparing for a horizon where there will be something after the ride we can't really figure out if we're even allowed to get off of. And you know, I was reading both of y'all's books around the same time. I have very lively dreams when I read books with people I know. Y'all hung out at the press in Claremont, which is no longer open, so it has to be a fantasy. COVID killed the press.
I didn't know about that. That is actually the first place I met you.
I know.
Yeah.
So this is just one of my goals when both of your books are out. It'll give me a reason to talk about both of them again. And
I would love to. Yeah, let's reconnect about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So
yeah, I mean thinking about like what is lost in the future is such an incredibly daunting task. There's a really good book that came out recently, a novel by Stephen Markey called the Deluge, that I think is a wonderful. It was really weird to read because he did so many of the points down to the specific mercenary firms that he talks about as kind of like casting a near-term 2030s vision of the future. Were things that I talked about in my book. So it's a really wonderful kind of fictionalization. But, you know, you say that in comparison to Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, which I like in many respects. And I love Kim Stanley Robinson, but it's also, it's a best case scenario, right? And,
but that's not how it's experienced, right? It's only a best case scenario if you go into it knowing what the worst is.
Yeah, knowing what is on the horizon. But I mean, like you allude to like the things that we are leaving that our children will not experience the same. You know, like one of the images that I draw on is just that the sky will look different, right, in the future. When modelers start incorporating, which they don't yet, but they're probably they're right on the cusp. The 5 or 6 big models that the IPCC uses to calculate everything from like crop yield loss to warming to water usage and all of that. Once they start incorporating solar radiation management, putting aerosols into the atmosphere, we are going to realize that we can actually solve all of the warming problem for about $2 or $5 billion a year, right? And that's going to become extremely seductive. Now, the problems will mount because of all of the acidification in the ocean, the breakdown of the food chain, the pollution, everything else gets way, way worse. And then we might end up stopping solar radiation management, and all of that warming will come back within 10 years, right? Down the road, right? But it looks like we're probably going to do that. And what that means is that in the day, the skies will not be blue anymore. They will be kind of a milky white haze. The sunsets will be more vividly red and beautiful, but the night skies won't have stars in them anymore. And so just that image.
It's like the ecological Ozempic. It's like Ozempic for ecological crisis. Like you're like, it's a solution. Can you imagine? You got to keep doing it, but then all of a sudden you realize your bone density dropped dramatically.
Yes, literally. And we might decide that we actually have to stop because the side effects from it are mount and could involve collapsing monsoons. And, you know, it might limit warming, but it might also kill 1 billion people in a year, right? At some point, right? You know, that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but we could talk about tens or even hundreds of millions of people lost in entire collapses of the food chain in the ocean, right? Starving people on multiple fronts, right? Because of that, if we start mounting it enough, like a century on, right? And so just that image of like, you know, what do we do with the sense of doom? You know, it is terrifying, and it should be terrifying. It's also, it's an incredible opportunity. Another image that we get in Kim Stanley Robinson's, you know, future is, you know, like what if we get through this and instead of like flying around on planes, emitting twice as much carbon dioxide as just driving somewhere would be, we ban planes and we get around on, electric, blimps, and actually travel takes a lot longer and people do more remote work and don't have to be at the office. And when you go somewhere, it's a whole trek instead of something that you're stressed out about doing as quickly as you can and getting through airport security and all of that. There's so many different ways that we can think about the future that actually could be wonderful, right? If we could just get it together, right? It's a political problem, right? Which means it's a capital problem, which means that I don't get a say and you don't get a say. None of us get a say, right? And so barring the agency, we need to get ready for what could also be the most brutal time that human beings have ever experienced, right? And that is something sorry, I don't mean to, kind of spin this back up again, but yeah, that's where my head goes with like thinking about the future and children is the best and the worst and kind of very little in between, right?
Well, I don't know. I think you just said vote blue no matter who. That's what Tad just said.
That's the message. That's the, yeah, right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for hanging out. And it's been a lot of fun to get to talk to you again.
Yeah. Thanks, Trip.